Hey guys, I'm Andy Raffel from eTeknix.com, and as you know, we recently had the Z390 launch from Intel, and along with that came pretty much over 50 motherboards from various different brands. Now, one of them brands is Super O, which is a derivative of SuperMicro, and today we've got the C9Z390-CG-IW, which is a very, very small, pint-sized powerhouse, as Super O would have it, mini-ITX motherboard. Let's take a look. So starting things off with what's inside the box. So inside we get two SATA cables, a driver CD, rear I/O plate, two Wi-Fi antennas, identification stickers for cable management, and a quick reference guide. So let's start by talking about the design. As you can tell, it is a mini-ITX board, and Super O, as I said, are branding it as a pint-sized powerhouse. So we're expecting a lot of performance in a very small form factor. Now, the overall design is quite simplistic, but it doesn't need to be anything too extravagant because it is just mini-ITX. Now, generally speaking, when you take a mini-ITX board and you put it inside a chassis, it's not going to be sort of, showed off as much as, say, what an ATX board would be, purely because small form factor chassis are in fact a lot smaller. So that means that cables and connectors and things like that pretty much kind of dwarf the board, and especially if you're going to put quite a fair size cooler on there as well, you will notice that it will cover up a lot of the board. In terms of the actual colour scheme, they've gone with quite, again, a simplistic design. It's black but has some nice kind of metal silver accents. So we have the one just sort of in front of the rear I/O, and then we have one over here as well, which also doubles up as an M.2 heatsink, I guess, but not in the way that you'd expect. To add a bit more premium quality to it, you will also notice that on the single PCI Express slot there is some metal armour, as well as on the memory slots as well. Now yes, this is an aesthetic feature, but it does have a lot more functionality to it in terms of protecting against electrostatic discharge, as well as GPU sag and other things like that. As I said, it is a mini-ITX board, so it does have a minimalistic design. Everything is kind of where you'd expect it to be, so let's sort of talk through exactly what it has. So in terms of RGB lighting, it's very, again, simplistic. There is a single set of RGB lights, which are actually on the back side of the motherboard, but they're situated in such a way that it actually allows it to kind of shine out the side. This is actually quite typical of ITX boards, and it adds a really nice effect when it bounces off the back of the chassis. If you want to take your RGB even further, there is a single RGB header. Sadly, this is not addressable, but every aspect of the RGB on this board can be controlled through Super O's booster software. In common with other Super O boards, you will find that the Super O booster software can also aid in overclocking and also changing the voltage, as well as other features. The CG-IW, being a mini-ITX board, includes a digital 7-phase PWM design. Yes, it may not sound like a lot, but actually 7 phases is more than enough for this pint-sized powerhouse. In terms of the CPU power delivery, it includes a single 8-pin connector to deliver TDP support for up to 120 watts to the processor. In terms of that power delivery, it should be more than enough for a board of this size. You will find that it just doesn't need the same power draw that an ATX board would need. Of course, in common with the 1151 socket and Z390 as a whole, it can accept both Intel 8th gen and also the newer 9th gen processors, like the i9-9900K that we're going to be testing it with today. In terms of cooling performance, there is a total of 3 heatsinks on this board, one along the top of the CPU socket, one just down the left-hand side of it, and also one covering the PCH, which actually doubles up as an M.2 heatsink. Now, I'm going to be honest about this, it's probably the weirdest design of M.2 heatsink I've ever seen. Normally you'd see it on top, but instead the M.2 drive actually sits on top of the heatsink. I can see that it actually should have a good effect, but I'm not entirely sure on how it's going to compare against a conventional design. But in terms of actually cooling down an M.2 drive, only sort of true enthusiasts are going to care. People who are doing things like rendering, where they're transferring large amounts of data on the M.2 drive, where it's going to be sort of subjected to a lot of usage over a short amount of time. For the majority of users, you're probably not even going to notice a difference. In terms of the 2 DIMM slots, as we said, it does come with that patented armour, and it does support speeds of DDR4, 3866 and higher. It supports a maximum capacity of 32 gigabytes, which you'll find for a mini-ITX board is actually more than enough. I think if you were to pair this board with some nice RGB memory, maybe with some sort of chrome heat spreaders on there, I think everything will pair quite nicely. The fact that it has the shielding on the memory and then the LEDs down the side, I think everything will just kind of amalgamate and look, well, pretty bitchin'. So now let's talk about fan headers. Now it is worth noting with a mini-ITX board, you generally don't get a lot of them, and that's actually true with this as well. There's 2 fan headers in total. One of them at the top for the system, and one for the CPU. There is also one USB 3.1 Gen 1 header next to the M.2 slot, one USB 3.1 Gen 2 Type-C connector, which is now run through the Z390 chipset. You also get a TPM header, and as we mentioned earlier, the one RGB header, which sadly is not addressable. For all of your storage needs, you'll find that there are 4 SATA ports, which are all facing vertically. They are SATA 3 and they do support RAID 0, 1, 5 and 10. For those needing a little bit more needs for their storage, obviously we do have M.2. So there's 2 PCIe 3.0 X4 M.2 slots, one on the front and one on the back of the board, which is actually pretty typical of mini-ITX. Both sockets support Type 2280 modules and are of course Intel Optane ready. Also, when you pair the 2 M.2 slots together, you can actually put the configuration in either RAID 0 or RAID 1 if you really want either redundancy or blistering fast speeds. Again, being a mini-ITX board, we are limited to how many expansion slots we have. So it has a single PCI Express 3.0 x16 slot. So sadly, you're not going to be able to do any multi-GPU configurations, but again, mini-ITX motherboard, you wouldn't actually expect it to do that. It does have that armored shielding on there as well, which is going to help with obviously electrostatic discharge, as well as GPU sag, among other protective features. Flipping the board around and looking at the rear I/O, for a mini-ITX board, it actually does have quite a few connections on it. So in total, we have a PS2 mouse keyboard combo port, 2 USB 3.1 Gen 1 Type A ports, a DisplayPort 1.2 port and HDMI 2.0, gigabit LAN using the Intel i1219V controller, 2 USB 3.1 Gen 2 Type A ports, 2 antenna connectors featuring dual band 802.11 AC plus Bluetooth 5.0 dual band Bluetooth, one more USB 3.1 Gen 2 Type A port, a USB 3.1 Gen 2 Type C port, HD audio jacks and SP diff. So I'm sure you agree there's pretty much every connection you could imagine that you'd ever physically need. And I like the fact that it has DisplayPort and HDMI. Dual monitor configurations, you've got it. In common with most of the Z390 boards that we've been looking at, the audio is no different on this. It incorporates the Realtek ALC 1220 7.1 HD channel audio. So yeah, nothing really out of the ordinary, but it does have obviously the audio jacks and the SP diff if you want to go down that digital route. So now let's talk a little bit about overclocking before we actually get into the stock and overclock performance. Now, Z390, as you can see, we've got plenty of boards next to us and we have actually already reviewed a lot of them and we invite you to go and check them out. Now, when it comes to overclocking, you actually find that pretty much all of the Z390 boards performed, well, the same in terms of overclock. They all managed to get to 5 GHz and they were all around the same sort of voltage, which was actually 1.359 volts on this particular motherboard. Other motherboards range between sort of 1.35 and 1.39, so everything was pretty much typical. Yes, it has got a 7-phase design on it, but that didn't actually hinder the overclocking performance one little bit. Normally you'd find that on a smaller form factor you may actually have limitations, but the only real limitation you're going to get with this is if you're going to put it into a small form factor chassis. That's when you might start having some issues with heat, especially when overclocking and pushing more voltage through it. We tested it with an i9-9900K, which, as I'm sure you all know, isn't exactly the coolest chip on the planet. If you are going to obviously go for a board like this, you're probably going to pair it with something like a 9700K as opposed to a 9900K, so temperatures are going to be a little bit better. This is actually more of the fault of the CPU than the motherboard itself. But now that we've looked at overclocking, it's time to look at both performance at stock and overclocked. So as we saw from the results, this actually performed pretty much on par with all of the other Z390 boards on there. There's so much sort of margin of error between these Z390 boards that nothing really kind of establishes why one is better than the other, at least in terms of performance. It's all about the features and design and obviously overall style of the board. This is obviously a mini-ITX board, and as you can see, it didn't hinder the performance one little bit. Now, one thing we do want to talk about is pricing. So in America, the price of this board is $201 plus taxes and shipping, and in the UK, it's around £187, which is actually pretty much on par. If you saw our review of the ASRock Z390 Phantom ITX AC, you'll see that pricing is very similar, and actually specs are very similar between the two as well. Now, it just goes to show that mini-ITX is definitely, you know, a winner, and I'm quite a big fan of mini-ITX. I think if done right, it can look absolutely amazing. And as I said, especially if you paired it up with some RGB memory with some sort of, you know, chrome styling on there, I think it would go really, really nicely with the board. Now, yes, Super O aren't exactly the most established brand in the market, but SuperMicro are. You've got to remember that they herald their sort of name from the industrial sector, and they are a market leader there. So if they're able to bring that quality and that feature set down from the industrial sector down to the consumer level, then I think they're actually onto a winner here. And I mean, you even saw that the performance was, well, on par with some of the bigger, badder boards on the market today. I feel that if you was going to buy this board, yes, you wouldn't pair it with an i9-9900K, you'd be going for something a little bit lesser that would generate less heat. I mean, typically you could even go for a GPU-free system. It has got that DisplayPort and HDMI on the back, so I think this would probably be very good at doing something like a media PC, HTPC. And then at a later date, if you did want to put a graphics card in there, yes, you do have the functionality to do that as well. Let us know in the comments section below, do you like mini-ITX as a form factor? And if you do, is this the sort of board you'd buy? Or would you buy a competitor brand, and for what reason? Is it just a branding thing, or do they offer extra features that you need? Personally, I think this one offers everything you'd need on such a small package. Small package. Until next time guys, you know what to do. I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye.